Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to today's session of Automation Hour. We are thrilled that you are here. So before we dive in, as usual, we'll go through a few logistics. So Mary, if you want to take us to that next screen, please. We do have all the lines muted. However, we would absolutely love your interaction here. So please post your questions. You can use the question widget here in GoToWebinar, or you can post them in our Trailblazer community group. We do try and answer all the questions before we wrap the episode. So get those questions in when you have them. We are also recording this, and we will be posting this after the session to our YouTube channel. And if you've registered, you'll also receive that link via email. And of course, we invite you to follow us on your preferred social media platform. So find us on the Trailblazer community, our website, Twitter, LinkedIn, and of course, YouTube for all of our previous sessions. All right, so we have turned Automation Hour into a boot camp for this year. We're going to help everybody learn flows. Great lineup of presenters. We are in April now, so here's a list of what we've done so far this year and what we have upcoming through the first half of the year. And then we have rounded out the rest of the year with the sessions here. So you can join as many as you wish or as few as you wish based on what makes the most sense for you and where you are on your automation journey. All right, so next up, we want to make sure that we shout out to our sponsors. We could not do this without their support, and we are so very appreciative. So first of all, Concrete.io has been with us since we launched Automation Hour, and we are absolutely thrilled to have them continue to be a sponsor. Next up, we also have Sumo Scheduler, who has graciously agreed to support us, and we want to thank them for their support. And of course, last but not least by any means, Active Campaign. They help us out sending you all those great reminder emails so that you can come join these amazing sessions every other week. All right, so you have your co-hosts. I'm Michelle Hansen. You also have Rakesh Gupta here on the line, but let's face it, you're not here to talk to us. I would love at this point to hand it over to our fabulous guest presenter, MVP, and all-around amazing Salesforce professional, Mary Tagler. So Mary, take it away.
Thanks, Michelle. Happy Friday, everyone, and welcome to Fundamentals of Formulas. I'm Mary Tagler. Michelle already gave me a pretty great introduction, but I am a applications manager for our Salesforce admin team at a company called Relativity based out of Chicago. So with that, I will jump in. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about where we can use formulas, recipes for formula success, core concepts. We're going to go through some group exercises. We're going to talk about some troubleshooting tips, common mistakes, and we'll round it out with some resources. I will make sure I work with Michelle and Rakesh to make sure you have the resources available to you on demand. So with that, let's jump in. I know one of the main reasons you're here is formulas can be used in Flow, but let's talk a little bit about some of the other places we can use formulas. We can use them in our fields, our reports, our validation rules, process builders, workflows, code, and there are probably some other areas of the system I'm leaving out, but those are the key areas of the platform and really why formula building is such an important skill set for every admin. So let's talk about some of our recipes for formula success. How do we set ourselves up to be successful? First up, best practices. We want to make sure we are using the tools that are available to us. What I mean by that is don't be afraid of those insert buttons and those global variables that make our lives a lot easier. Recognize there's more than one way to do it right. There are multiple ways to write formulas and achieve the same results. Sometimes that means they'll compile differently and be less efficient, but we're going to try and write the leanest, cleanest formulas today that we can. We always want to be kind to our current and future self and teammates by describing our intent, whether that be adding comments or using description fields to help us when we have to go back and troubleshoot. The next few are really around, again, ease of troubleshooting, ease of comprehension, using indenting or text editors to make our formulas more readable, also to improve troubleshooting, avoiding hard coding IDs. No one likes to come to a formula and find a mystery ID and then have to figure out what it applies to. Being consistent, putting our ands before ors, while not a requirement, stylistically are always trues for are sometimes truths, again, improves readability and comprehension. Not forgetting that our error messages can misdirect us and frustrate us. A missing comma may manifest as a missing parenthesis. So we always want to make sure that we're looking through our entire formula and not just getting caught up in what the error message is telling us. And let's try and avoid things like double negatives. Rather than saying things like it's not, this field is not equal to false, let's just simply say it's equal to true. And again, improve that ease of speed, comprehension, and making everything as readable as possible. So what do real friends do? Real friends work in their sandbox. They don't write their formulas in production. They test thoroughly and they peer review. They don't hard code IDs. Again, they're using those insert buttons. They're indenting. They're using the text editors. They're consulting the formulas and operators help doc. I will be linking to this further into the presentation, but this document on help and training is one of my favorites. It is bookmarked on every machine I own. If you're an Ohana Slack member, it's bookmarked in the formulas channel. But what's so great about this is it breaks down every function and operator available to you. It gives you the definition, it gives you the scenario, and it gives you a syntactically accurate example of how that is used. So when in doubt, when using a formula or operator that maybe you don't use on a frequent basis, this is a really great resource. And again, let's use those description fields and where appropriate error messages effectively to help us out. So I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the frustrating 15 and 18. What I'm referring to is our IDs. IDs come in two flavors, 15 characters and 18 characters. 15 character IDs are case insensitive, meaning if you're going to VLOOKUP, you're going to have lots of issues with a 15 character ID. There are tools out there that can help us move from 15 to 18 and 18 to 15. We have our functions, our case safe ID to move a 15 character ID to 18. And we have left that allows us to trim any number of characters off of a field, including moving an 18 character ID back to 15. We have third-party tools like Organizer and Admin Booster and some Excel-based tools that we can use if we're working with a spreadsheet. There are points where 18 character IDs are not your friend, particularly when dealing with validation rules and formulas. That's where we need to use 15. So this is really key to remember because when you check the syntax of your formula, it won't warn you that you've used an 18 character ID. It just won't process correctly, which is even more frustrating because you think you've built in a stopgap for either data integrity or population reasons, and it's actually not working as intended because you went with 18. So with that, we're going to jump into some core concepts. Again, those things that'll help you set you up for success, help you break down the concepts of formula writing, and hopefully be reusable for you in your admin career. So let's talk about some of the core functions. There are a lot of functions out there that we will use in our formulas. These are some of the ones that I personally find the most frequently used in my day-to-day admin career. We have our basic logic, our ifs, ands, ors, or not. We have our other logical operators such as equals, less than, greater than or equal to, etc. Then we have a lot of text operators that allow us to do things like check for blank fields, work with pick lists, look for things that are changed, new, look for things that contain specific characters. Then we have our date functions. So grabbing today, looking for a date value. So converting a date time to a date, looking for a date time value, adding months, days, things like that. And then we have our UX related functions. Those are things like creating hyperlinks out of a formula or using images in a formula to display images on a conditional basis. And again, I have the link here. I will make sure it's available to you to look at that formulas and operators document that Salesforce kindly provides to us. So I like to think about formula writing as really kind of like creative writing in a way. You sketch out what you plan on doing in automation or code. Why wouldn't you do it with your formula? Why is it important? It'll help you readily find some of your logic gaps. It'll let you organize your formula for efficiency. And one of the things that you should be doing is you should be reviewing what you've been asked to create with your stakeholders. So by writing it out in plain language, what you're doing is putting it in a language your stakeholders can understand and allow them to validate versus handing them a formula, which is probably going to make them cry or complain or tell you they don't know what it says. So again, I think of formula writing similar to regular writing. We're using words, we're using clauses, we're using punctuation, and spelling counts. And again, we have to do things like pair our parentheses, separate clauses with commas if we're using our words, all of that kind of stuff that is important to write clearly and coherently. So with that, the other side of the coin is limitations. There are some limitations when we build formulas. Formula fields are not the same as roll-ups. If you're looking to create a formula to count the number of contacts on your account, that is not going to be doable with a formula. That's going to be something you're going to need a roll-up for. Formula fields have compilation and character limits, so it's important to understand how to write lean, clean formulas. You can't delete a field that has been referenced in a formula. You'll have to dereference it before you can remove that field from your org. Please always be careful when using your formulas in automation. Formulas are what we call calculated. They're not stored values. So the record must be accessed in some way to get their value. So what that means is you never want to base your automation solely on a formula field as a trigger. You will be very disappointed in the results, trust me. The other thing I talk about briefly is that Salesforce also limits the number of unique object references you can have on an object. Those are calls out to other objects, whether it be by formula field, lookup field. Those are the two main ways you can do it. So why I'm mentioning this is I already talked about not wanting to hard code IDs. But one of the things to know is one of the things that can add to the number of references that we use is referencing a record type name or a developer name in a formula. The ideal way would be to use an ID, but since we don't want to reference an actual ID, we want to use what we would consider an ID proxy. I have a link later in the deck that will talk about ways you can use proxies instead of using the actual ID. And again, this would include references to users, groups, or record types, among other things. So on some of our objects like cases, we actually have a lot of those 15 references used up just by out-of-the-box functionality. So let's take a moment to talk about wrapping and nesting. So wrapping is enclosing a function in another function. It can be used to treat a picklist field as text. It can be used to check for when a field isn't blank. And the rule of thumb when wrapping functions is to move inward and outward. Inward to outward, excuse me. So in this example, if we're checking if a field is not blank, first we're going to check if it's blank using that isBlank function, and then we are going to wrap that whole statement in not. So we're looking for the field not being blank. We can also use it to parse data. So we could pull the day from a date field, or we can add a number to something. So nesting, similarly, is when we use complex logic. The easiest way to describe it is if-then statements. We might use a nested if statement if we have multiple conditions. If this, then that. Otherwise, if the next thing, then the next thing, and if none of that, else. And we'll go through an example that'll spell that out in a little more detail and a little more clearly. Same thing with multiple and or statements. That's another case where you'll use nesting. In some cases, we could avoid nesting with tools like case functions. And it's always important to indent, because as you indent each nested function, it will be easier again to make sure you're closing things out in the right places and troubleshooting. So let's talk about a couple common missteps. Again, we've already talked about most of these. So, formula fields are calculated. They're not stored values. Not mapping out your logic in advance and just trying to go with your gut. Referencing more than one pick list value for a single field. This is a syntactical error I see a lot, where a user will use is pick val, and then they'll separate every value on that pick list field they want by commas. It doesn't work that way. Unfortunately, we can't shortcut like that. You'll need to use a is pick val function per pick list value. Conflating when to use and versus or. We will go through an example of this later in the deck. Free typing field values and field names from memory, spelling counts, and if we spell incorrectly, we won't get an error necessarily, but our formula will not work as intended. Not consulting our syntax examples. Again, that formulas and operators document that Salesforce provides us. Misspelling, punctuation, and double negatives. Not reviewing our field types, ensuring we know which fields are texts, numbers, pick list versus multi-select, date versus date time, and how we handle our blank fields. So let's jump in and do a few exercises. Before we get started, Michelle, are there any questions?
We have a couple of questions.
Okay.
Mostly people are very excited for the links that you have mentioned, specifically the one on writing formulas. So I did assure everyone that we'll post the deck along with the recording to YouTube, but if you happen to have those links handy and we can throw them in the chat, we can absolutely do that as well.
I don't have it handy now, but I think I have a QR code further into the deck, so you should be able to get it on demand before we wrap today.
Perfect.
Okay, so let's jump in. So we're going to do a series of exercises. We're going to go through some scenarios, and we're going to first start by writing it out. We're going to look at what the formula looks like, and then I have a slide that breaks it down in detail. So in our first exercise, we're going to use a couple different functions, and is blank, text, and left. Our scenario is the status field can't be blank on the customer account record type for anyone other than system admins and support. So let's write it out. Our status field is blank and we're noting that status is a pick list field. Our customer record type is customer account, and our user is not a system admin, and our user is not support. This is the first space in which people tend to conflate and or. We want to make sure we're using and here for our admin and our support user. If we use or, either one of those things can be true, not both. And just pointing out two things, validation rules always must evaluate to true to fire. And we have an 18-character custom label for this record type ID. So we have created that ID proxy. So I color coded the brackets for ease of reading. We've got our and statement, which bundles every single clause. We've got our pick list field that we've converted to text, and we're checking if it's blank. Again, moving inward to outward. We've got our record type ID. We're using that ID proxy, but remember, we can only use 15-character IDs in our formula, so we are using left to trim off the last 3 and only take the first 15. We're using one of our global variables for profile, and the profile name is not equal to system administrator or is not equal to support. So
Hey,
when we
Mary,
break it, oh, sure.
can you hop back to that one real quick?
Yep.
So can you explain for everybody why when you're doing the profile names you used and instead of or?
Sure. So you're using, if we were to use or in our rule, we would need to change the syntax here. But assuming that's been done, what we would be saying is if the profile name is system administrator or is not system administrator or it is not support, which means it's going to read in order. And if I am a support user, it would still block me from making the change because it's not system administrator. That part's true. It's a if we were using or, it would be one or the only one of the two things must be true. If we use and, both things have to be true. Does that help?
I think so. It's something that I know a lot of people definitely get tripped up by because
Yes,
even you said it when you said it in English, it's not system administrator or support, but
right.
it's that nuance of it's not system administrator and it's also not support.
Yes, and on the next screen, we're gonna break it down a little bit more, and that's one of the reasons I personally think writing it out is super helpful because what usually happens is when someone gives you those instructions, they will say or because it makes sense in our head. It seems like the right way to phrase what they're getting at, but from a logic perspective, it's actually not accurate. And I will say it takes practice. This is probably one of the things that dogged me the longest when learning how to formula write.
We have one other question.
Sure.
Mark had mentioned I have used is pickval status and then the value. Is that wrong?
Good question. It is not wrong, and I will be using both. It's really stylistic choice. I like to convert mine to text status or to text fields because I can use things like equals or not equals. But is pickval is completely acceptable, and you will see it in further examples. So we talked about at the top, we're using that and statement to bring everything together. All of those clauses separated by commas are ands. They all have to be true. We're using is blank with our pick list, so we have to convert it to text. As Mark mentioned, we have the alternate approach. We can use is pickval and the double quotes with no space between them to denote a blank value. We're using a custom label for our record type. I'll go back just a second and using that again, that global value of label to reference it. I like to label my labels in a consistent naming convention. I like to start with the object. I like to then start, if it's a record type, the name, and then I usually just put RT for shorthand to refer to a record type. If it's a specific account record, I will put the name of the customer. I like to do it because it self-alphabetizes, so I don't have to go hunt down in the thousands of labels my org has and figure out if I've already created this label. I can go to account and see them all nicely grouped together for me. Again, we talked about we're using the left to get to 15. We talked about our global variables, and we're using the two carets facing away from each other for not equal. Again, there's an alternate approach here. We can use the exclamation point equals or bang equals to also represent not equals. So let's move into another example. In this case, we want to send an email when an opportunity is won and a pick list called partner involvement is co-sell, and the account isn't Salesforce or Relativity. So we write it out. Our opportunity stage is one, and our partner involvement is co-sell, and again, reminder, double check the exact spelling of your pick list value. Our account is not Salesforce, and our account is not Relativity. So again, we don't want to get tripped up by the request. Our stakeholders often will use or for things that are really and situations. We use and because we need both statements to be true. We can't rely on only one of them being true. And we use the 15 character custom labels. So what does that look like in our formula syntax? We have our and wrapping everything together, our commas separating our clauses, And again, we've converted our pick list to text. So we're using stage name equals 1, partner involvement equals co-sell, and it can't be either of these. So we're saying it's not Salesforce and it is not relativity. So when we break it down, again, we're using that text to convert our pick list fields. We're using our labels. I've already talked about this, so I won't go into great detail, but I've provided some examples of ways you can create consistent naming conventions on your labels to keep them more organized and avoid duplication.
So Mary, this is probably a good point to bring up here because you've used custom labels a couple times and we got several questions about those.
Sure.
So number one, the $ label is a custom metadata entry, correct?
No, custom metadata is separate. Are you talking about custom metadata types or just metadata in general?
Metadata types. And Pavel actually, that was from Stacy, and Pavel actually asked a similar question. Why would you use custom label for the record type ID rather than custom settings or custom metadata?
So you could use a custom setting or you could use a custom metadata type. I find them a little more heavyweight because you need to create what's basically the equivalent of an object and then create fields to store all the IDs. So we do use that at times. If I had, say, one of our real world examples is we escalate items from Salesforce into Jira. We escalate the same field, could have different values on the Jira side. So we've created a custom metadata type with various entries underneath it for the various values that map to Jira. In this case, with a custom label, I use them when it's really lightweight, when there's really just a one-to-one match. So in this case, I have a particular user that in this case, I just used my last name. That's me. It would not be a great example. In theory, you'd want a functional reference. But rather than creating a lot of that overhead, creating the object and having to look through the object to the specific field, it's faster, fewer characters to just simply use the label. I hope that helps.
I think so. So Mark wants to know, what are your thoughts about using record type dot developer name equals ABC as opposed to the custom label, I assume?
So if you are not concerned about your limit on references, I am totally okay with that. For us, we have a lot of heavily used objects. So our case object, for example, is extremely heavily used. So we've had to be very judicious where we create unnecessary references. So on those objects, I would say you would be much better served using either a custom metadata type, custom setting, or custom label, and not using up one of your 15 or 20 if you've gone to support references. But if you have a custom object that doesn't look out to a number of other objects, I think it's totally fine. And to Mark's point, I would strongly urge you to use developer name over label because labels can change, developer names should not, or they're going to break a lot of things.
Excellent. If you happen to have any links on custom labels, I think Reese and Robert both would appreciate learning more about how custom labels help you with using for IDs.
Sure. I have a link to the admin blog post on it, which I think will be helpful. The other thing that's nice about custom labels, like custom metadata types, etc., is you can deploy them. So if you're using a deployment tool, you can push them out. And rather than having to do a data load, I know you will have to do a data load, I believe, with custom settings, if I'm not mistaken. Any
Perfect.
other questions?
I think that is all we have for now.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about dates. I'm going to be frank here. Dates and times are not my favorite. I can do basic date formulas all day. Let me preface that. I hate time formulas. I will not be going over time formulas other than converting between date times and dates. So I just want to put that out there. Even for seasoned formula writers, there are those things that just cause us headaches and want to tear our hair out. And for me, that's it. But in this case, we want, for records created after May 1st, 2022, we want to designate all open lead records created in the last 15 days as a fresh lead and anything older as mature leads. So when we write it out, we say the created date is greater than or equal to May 1st, 2022. Remembering that our created date field, the system field, is a date time field. Our lead status is open, and our lead is, if it's less than 15 days old, display fresh lead. And if it's more than 15 days old, display mature lead. So what does that look like? So we're using our is pick val as one of our options. This is our first introduction to an if statement. So we've got the if statement closing out the entire clause. The first section is our logic. So if the date, we're changing it to a date by using the date value function, is greater than or equal to May 1st, 2022, and this is a syntax, you must put date fields in if you're using the date function, and our pick list value status is open, and today minus our created date. Again, today is one of our few functions that requires nothing between the parentheses, today and now and is new being 3 that I can think of off the top of my head. Today minus our created date is less than 15, show fresh lead. Otherwise, show mature lead. So let's talk about it. So we use if because we have differing outcomes based on specific values. We've talked a bit about how we're using our date value to change a date time to a date. We use date to specify the date. We use today, a dynamic value, because we want to count the days between the current day and a specific point in time. We use greater than or equal to because we need to include the current day in our calculation. And caveat here, this is just an example. We'd want to ensure that we've done something with the records created before May 1st if of a status other than open, because otherwise it would display mature lead. So these aren't bulletproof examples. These are more illustrative for understanding how to build the formula. Any questions before I jump into the next one, Michelle?
Let me double check. I've been answering a couple with that link that we found, and I put that in chat. So nope, I think we are good.
Okay, so we're gonna build on our example, and we're gonna do our nested if statement. So again, remember we talked about nesting is where the if then else logic is not sufficient. We have more complex logic that we need to accommodate. So in this case, our records are still created on or after May 1st. We want to designate all open lead records created within the last 15 days as fresh lead. If it's been 30 days, so 16 to 30, it's a mature lead. And anything older is stale. So we're going to write it out. Our created date is greater than or equal to May 1st, 2022. Our lead status is open. Our leads less than or equal to 15 days old are fresh. Our leads less than or equal to 30 days old are mature. And anything older than, oh, that's a typo. Anything older than 30 is stale. I will fix that before I reshare it to Michelle. So what does that look like? We have two if statements, or nested ifs. A good rule of thumb is your closing parentheses need to match the number of if statements. So if I have two if statements, I need to have two closing parentheses at the end. I usually go through and count them and then just add that number of parentheses at the end. We've got our logic, which was the same in our earlier formula, to equal fresh lead. Now we're saying if it's not a fresh lead and our created date is greater than or equal to May 1st, 2022, and the status is open, and today minus the date value is minus the created date is less than 30, mature lead. Otherwise, stale lead. So I want to pause on this for a moment because this can be confusing. This formula will process or be evaluated in order. So I don't have to specify 16 to 30 here because this clause will be evaluated first. So if the lead is 0 to 15 days old, it will automatically tag it fresh lead. And if that is not true, the system will next evaluate our second clause. So because 30 encompasses 0 to 15, it's really only caring about 16 to 30. And then it's going to be mature lead. And then after that, stale lead. I'm anticipating I'm going to get some questions.
So we have one from Sally. What is the reason for using date value before created date, since created date is already a date? I've written formulas where I use the date value or don't when working with created date, and it doesn't seem to matter.
So created date is a, actually, I should fix this here. Created date is a date time field, even though it's called created date. And so you will have to, you should, I need to fix this as well. You should actually convert date time fields to dates to compare to other dates. So you need like comparisons.
Okay, so for stale leads, how does the formula know to evaluate that one?
So it knows to evaluate that one based on the fact that none of the prior clauses are true. So in an if statement, nested or not, if all the logic before it is false, it will default to this else statement. So in this case, if it were 0 to 15 days, it would tell you fresh lead. If it were 16 to 30, it would tell you mature lead. And if it's none of those things, it's going to tell you stale.
Perfect. That answered our question there, and I think that's all we have for now.
Okay, I'm gonna keep going. So let's talk about working with pick lists. We're talking about the case function and commenting. So our sales team covers certain verticals. Federal, municipal, and nonprofit are considered public sector verticals. Healthcare and financial are considered regulated, and everything else is considered general sales. So when we write it out, if the industry is federal, municipal, or nonprofit, display public sector. If the industry is healthcare or financial, display regulated. And if it's none of the above, display general sales. So we could write out an is pick val statement for all of these and a bunch of if statements, but we don't need to. We can use our case function. So our case function encompasses everything in the red brackets, and we're looking at the field industry. So when using a case statement, the first thing you reference is the field that you're talking about. So it has to be isolated around a single field. And everything on the left side of each line is the pick list value on that field. Everything on the right side is what we want it to return in our formula field. So federal, public sector, municipal, public sector, nonprofit, public sector, etc. We've added commenting here with our /* enclosing anything that we want to say. This can contextually provide information to anyone reading the formula. It will not get evaluated. You can also use commenting to do things like test your formulas. Maybe you want to comment out the 9 financial regulated. You can use the /* to comment it out and remove it from the formula. If your formula isn't working the way you expect, you could comment out certain places and see if it is working as expected in those certain places and sort of narrow down where your problem is. And then similar to our if statement, at the bottom, we close out with general sales, or everything else that doesn't apply up here. So I've broken it down. Again, we talked about you can use case when you have a series of values such as a pick list number or a percent field. You could use your commenting using your /*. And again, I mentioned that you can deactivate sections of formulas to test the impact of removing logic or troubleshoot by using those comments. So let's go into another automation example. When a lead is assigned to a user from a queue and the product interest field, a multi-select pick list contains widgets, post a message to the widget team's Slack channel. We're going to assume the actual flow building is handled separately. We're only concerned with the formula. So we're going to write it out. A lead is assigned to any user and it was previously assigned to a queue and product interest has the widgets value selected. So how do we write it? We're going to use our trusty and statement. We're going to use begins because we only care about the beginning of the text string. And in this case, we're going to look at an owner ID. Many of you probably have figured this out now, but every object has a 3-character prefix. Owner has a 005 prefix. So we know that if the owner ID value is 005, it is a user. We know that if the owner value has 003, it is a queue. So here we're looking for an owner ID that is a user. Here we're looking for where the prior value of the owner ID begins with 00G. Again, we move inward to outward when reading the logic. And we use includes because we're dealing with a multi-select pick list field, the phrase widgets. And again, I talk about the prefixes here. We use begins to grab the first number of characters. And be careful that include versus includes are two completely different functions. Okay, so let's calculate a renewal date example. When an opportunity is won, we capture the expiration date of our contracts. We would like to create a renewal opportunity with a close date 3 months before expiration. So if we write it out, it's pretty simple. The close date on a renewal opportunity is 3 months before the most recent opportunity's expiration. We're only concerned with calculating the new close date, not the automation. So we're going to use a handy formula called add months. I think of it as a little bit of a misnomer because you can add negative months. So we take our expiration date, we subtract 3, and we have effectively taken off 3 months to the day from that expiration date. Okay,
Awesome. So we got a couple questions popped in.
Okay.
So on your previous example, for moving from the queue to a user, Sally
Yep.
wanted to know, is there an alternate way to define user versus queue?
I can't think of one. That's the most effective way I have found.
Awesome.
Any other?
Nope. I had shot the Daniel Ballinger's obscure reference URL in
Yes.
chat for the 3-digit prefixes, and Deb shared another one from Salesforce Ben. I'll post that one in the chat as well, but I will note that if you look at help documentation on Salesforce prefixes, they actually reference Daniel's website at Fish of Price, since he now works for Salesforce. And I think it's the epitome of awesomeness when Salesforce help references your website. Like, I think that's awesome.
It is. Okay, so we're going to talk about custom permissions. This is another really useful tool that I feel like is underappreciated. I know we're here to talk about formulas, but we're going to talk a little bit about custom permissions as well. So we want certain users to be able to edit the account name on existing accounts. These users have a custom permission called edit account name. So a custom permission is a type of metadata. It's really easy. You basically create a new record, you give it a name. Again, I am a huge believer in standardizing your naming convention. So in this case, edit account name, and you assign it to a permission set. So the permission set is what allows us to give it to an ad hoc group of people. So in this case, we write it out. The account record is not new and the account name is changed and we want to block users who lack the edit account name custom permission. So what does that look like? Again, our trusty and statement. We have is new. So it's not is new. we have is changed, and we're looking at the name field, and we're saying this global value. So the permission of the current running user lacks this edit account name permission. And now we have blocked anyone who lacks this permission from changing the account name field after it has already been created and saved to the database. So again, we've got the breaking and down slide. For time's sake, I'm going to skip past it, but I will take questions if we have any.
So we have one from, I think it's Bilal. What was the need for prior in the queue user example? Can you maybe go back through that one
Yep.
again?
Oh, I think I'm clicking in multiple directions. Sorry, hold on. Okay, so we want to know, oops, sorry. We want to know when the user went from being assigned to a queue to a user. So we need to use prior value because we care about where it used to be and where it went. So if we wouldn't want this to be an issue if it went from one queue to another queue or one user to another user. So we wouldn't want too many Slack messages to be hitting our channel. We only care. So a good example would be if you had a case and the case was owned by the queue and someone has taken ownership, you'd want to post that someone has taken ownership of that particular case. You don't care if it's gone from Michelle to me or me to Michelle. You only care that someone has claimed it from the queue and is actually working on it. I hope that helps.
Okay, so we've got a couple things around custom permissions from your most recent example.
Okay.
So Sally would like to know, where would you write that permission, on the field itself or somewhere else? And I'm also going to throw in chat a link to Salesforce help on custom permissions.
Thank you, Michelle. So custom permissions are actually their own item in setup. So if you type in the search box custom permission, it will take you there just like it would take you to say process builder or flow. And so that's where you actually create it. They are not object specific. I give my names because I don't want to create a custom permission that is so broad that if I were to want to use it in automation and validation rules in code, that I would potentially be permissioning users to do multiple things, because then it becomes harder to manage who should have that permission set. So I would rather have a lot of custom permissions that are very discrete than having few custom permissions that are extremely broad. You can also use custom permissions, just as an FYI, as a great way to control visibility on things like components. So maybe you want to give only a certain number of users the ability to make a change or access a flow or a button. Custom permissions is another good way to do that.
Yeah, we've got a couple people, Pavel and Kristen in chat, both are saying that they absolutely love using custom permissions, especially for bypassing validation rules. So if you want it to not apply to a specific person or in a specific scenario, you can use that custom permission and assign it to a user via permission set to exempt them from the validation rule.
Yes, and this is way better than saying like, it's not Michelle Hansen, because what if Michelle decides to change her last name? Then that no longer works. Or it's not an ID and you're not putting a long list of IDs in here. This is something where you won't have to actually touch the formula. You would only have to assign or remove an assignment of a permission set to control who can do it. I find that pretty great, because the less I have to touch my automation or my formulas, the better, frankly.
All right, we're all caught up on questions for now.
Okay, so blank field examples. There are two fields on account, industry and sector. When the account type is customer, both picklists fields must be populated. This is a really common and or conflation scenario. So we write it out. The account type equals customer and the industry is blank or the sector is blank. I've written it out here. We use or because if we use and, it would only fire in the scenario where both fields were blank. That's not what we want. We want to make sure both fields get populated. So we care if industry is filled out, great. But if sector is blank, that rule needs to fire. If industry is blank, but sector is filled out, the rule needs to fire. So it really covers all the scenarios. If both fields are blank, the formula is going to evaluate in order. It's going to stop you right here anyway. So you don't want to use and, you want to use or. So we write it out. Our field, our type is customer. And again, we're using our nesting. This is all part of our or statement. It's either industry is blank or, and I've just flipped around using pick list versus text, our sector field is blank.
So
I'm
from a
expecting
stylistic
questions.
standpoint, yep. From this is actually my question. So from a stylistic standpoint, um, would you ever actually mix these in your org?
I would prefer not to. I did it more for illustrative purposes than how I would write it. I would be consistent. I don't like to mix it, but I also, if someone on my team gave me something to peer review, I would not make them change it. It would make me cringe a little bit inside, but I would not make them change it. And if I had a valid reason to go back and address this formula for a different reason, I would fix it.
Perfect. All right.
I'm a big
So
fan
far,
of consistency.
yes. So Caesar asked fix what? We were noting that in her or statement, one of them used the is pick val function, and the other one used the text function to convert the pick list to text, and then used the is blank function on what is that? 1, 2, 3, line 4
I
and
used
line
it,
5.
yeah, yeah.
So Caesar, hopefully that answers that.
And I have the deck I'm going to share is actually slightly different. All the examples are the same, but I'm realizing I did not use the deck that has the option with symbols instead of words. So I will provide that. And it'll show you the syntax for using symbols. I feel like most people sit in one camp or another. They're symbols or they're words. Clearly from my presentation, I'm a words fan, using and or as opposed to the double and sign and like the pipes. And it does change whether you need commas and where you need parentheses in some cases, but the deck I share back will have that in there for you.
I am actually apparently a very weird person and have been told that this could cause issues, so I'm trying to change. But I like to mix the and or with the with
With the
the
symbols,
values that yeah with the symbols. Simply because if you nest them too far down, like my eyes start to cross. And so like if I have like the top level and it's this one thing and then there's an or underneath it, I'll use the double ampersands for like this top level is always, and then I have an and then I have all of this other stuff that's or, and I'll put that inside the or function. So it's very interesting to see how people do this, and
it
we are
is. And
having a debate in the answers panel over here. I've
yeah,
got
and I
team
think
text
that if
and
you
team symbols.
indent, it helps a lot. Um, and so that would be my biggest advice is like if you're going to use symbols, just make sure you indent. I tend to see a lot of symbol writers just write long strings, and that's just really hard to read.
Yeah. Um,
And I mean, the same goes for word users. Like if you're going to use words and you're going to just make really, really long strings, it's really hard to read. So these are the resources that I am going to include. Because I am not using the deck I thought I was, I don't have the QR code, but Michelle is going to be so kind when I get her the final deck for sharing to make it available to you. So you all will have links to everything on this list and potentially a couple others. But again, this Salesforce formulas and operators function, it includes a section on helpful resources with sample formulas and best practices. The organizer Chrome extension, I love. It has an option for a formula editor, which I actually don't love, but everyone is different. You may love it yourself. There's a Chrome extension called Better Salesforce Formula Editor. I personally have not used it, but I've heard good things. Notepad++, if you're a Windows user, is a great way to type out your formulas in a text editor. The great thing about any text editor you use is you could save it and go back to it like you would a Word document. So you don't have to worry about, maybe trying to save something that syntactically is throwing errors and it won't let you. You can save it in your text editor and paste it in whenever you like. There's also VS Code. So if you've already got that on your machine, you can use that as your text editor. There's brackets if you're a Mac user. This is that admin article on why hard coding IDs is bad and how to avoid it. This is one I have not talked about. I am a strong believer in everyone using their dev work to play around. It's actually how I got way better at formulas and way better at flow. I kind of would lurk in the answers community, see if I could solve things on my own, and it really made me better at building formulas. One of the things I learned is that Reed Carlberg, who used to work for Salesforce, created something for Steve Moe called the Moe Tester. It's on GitHub, and basically you can install it in your org, and it will give you a whole bunch, and please don't put this in your production org. It will give you a whole bunch of dummy objects and fields, and it will give you every single type of field. So it will give you date fields, date time fields, multi-select pick lists, etc., on all of these Moe tester objects, which is great because how many times have you gone in somewhere and just created a dummy field just to prove something out? You don't have to. You can use all of these as ways to test. So again, if you're trying to learn how to use formulas and functions and work with different field types, this is a great way to do it without having to really seed a lot of metadata and data in your org.
That's fantastic. So we've got several questions coming in, and you just reminded
Okay.
me of a couple other interesting tidbits. So first off, Sally had a question on your sector example.
Okay. See
I
if I
think that
can
was your
find
last
it.
one. Is the reason the sector is written in API with the underscore C different than industry? Is it because it's a custom field?
Let's see.
And I
I need to
think
find
if
the
I'm,
example, but yes.
yeah, I think what it is that industry is technically the API name of the standard field. And so that's why industry doesn't have the underscore C, but sector would
Yes.
be a custom field. So you're always using
Yes.
API names no matter what. In this
Yes.
instance, you're using, industry is the field name and is the API name, and then you're looking at the values, which is why all of those have spaces.
Yes. And yes, and if you're using your insert buttons, you don't have to care if industry is customer standard because it will put the API name in the right syntax for you. And it's also important to note, something I didn't write here is those insert buttons are really important because if you write a formula in Flow versus process filter versus a validation ruler formula, the syntax for referencing fields is all slightly different. So free typing will not do you any favors.
No, nope. Field picker is my best friend.
Yes.
So Reese had a question. I'm guessing the comment does not cause any compile issues.
That I am not an expert in, but I did, I believe, include a link earlier on about comments. So I'm not sure actually. I don't use them very heavily, but I do use them. I use them more for troubleshooting where I might just comment something out on the fly if I can't get my formula to work and can't seem to figure out why. So I could isolate which piece is causing me a problem.
Absolutely. If I remember correctly, somewhere I also heard that it does not impact your formula limit, which I know they just tripled to like 15,000
Yeah,
characters or whatever. So the other nice thing about comments is if you have a large formula, you can still comment it out without impacting your.
yeah, your character
So
limit.
yeah, Tim did mention that sometimes the comments will cause issues. So I think as with everything we showcase on Automation Hour, test and use at your own risk. Get
Yes,
your own
just
experience.
because you could doesn't mean you should. You do have the lovely description fields available to you. That's usually the place people are going to go first anyway, is the description field. So I would encourage you to try and put your comments there. And I really dislike when people use comments because they hard code IDs, so they just put what it is in comments instead. That's one of my big pet peeves. I mean, it's better than not putting anything there, but I still don't like it.
Right. So something I remember Steve most suggesting on a post, and I think this is great when you're working with formulas too. So most of the time formulas are something that we're hitting in validation rules, right? And
Yeah,
so when you're working to build your formula for your validation rule, he actually suggests building a test formula field on your object that will come out to say true or false based on whether or not your validation rule should fire. And that allows you to build a list view with all of the fields that are part of your formula, plus the formula field, to determine whether or not your validation rule would actually evaluate to true or false the way you expect it to.
I like it. I will
I,
say
yeah.
most people are probably not going to do that level of work. Um, that doesn't mean they shouldn't.
Absolutely. And it's one of those things where absolutely when I'm troubleshooting, the first thing I do is start breaking it down. And it's like, all right, most simple thing on here. Does the first part work? Yep. Okay, great. What about the second part? Does it work by itself? And then start adding the pieces together and figure out where it breaks.
Yeah, I go old school. I also like if I'm looking at a validation rule, I will write it by hand out. I double underline all my ands and ors, and I try and figure out like where the gaps are in the logic as well. Um, and so like for me, and I also do the same thing when I'm like trying to build a rule, unless it's like, you
Uh,
know, if this is greater than that, that's pretty straightforward. But like generally speaking, I like to physically write it out. Typing is not even just the same. It really helps my brain think and really process like what I'm trying to do and what I'm trying to not do.
That's awesome. All right, I'm going to do one last check for questions. Make sure I caught everything on the community, but I think we're all caught up in GoToWebinar. So yes, Gail confirming there will be a link to the recording for today's session. With your registration, you'll get that email. I think it's within like 24 hours. And again, once Mary gets us the distribution deck, we'll get this posted to YouTube along with a copy of that deck that will have all of the resources available for everyone.
My goal is to have that done before Monday, ideally today if I can swing it.
Perfect. So yeah, give us, I don't know, 72 hours turnaround and we'll do our best. So, but oh, Barry, the thank yous and awesomes and excellence are pouring in. I think this has been one of the best sessions that we have done on formulas, and it's going to be super helpful as we learn automation going forward this year.
Well, thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining me on a Friday afternoon.
Yep. Perfect. They just keep coming and coming and coming. Like Mary is a rock star as always from Christy. That's perfect. Fabulous. Fantastic. I think every superlative that is out there, I'm getting in our chat widget. So y'all appreciate the love for Mary and for us. And we appreciate you attending and we will let you all enjoy the rest of your Friday. Have a great afternoon, evening, morning, whatever.